Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. A good friend of mine about 2 years ago inherited the house of his grandparents. He decided to live there for the time being till he figured out what to do with the place. He grew up in it, so he didn't really want to sell it. Not even a week after he moved in, he got a visit from a neighborhood committee. They said they were the 3 board members of the HOA and were there so he could sign his membership papers. They were extremely nosy and rude. For example, one tried to get into the garage without so much as asking. When my friend stopped him and asked where he was going, the guy had the audacity to say, "I need to check your garage if everything there is in order. I have a right to do this bi-weekly, and denying me access is an offense that will cost a fine." My friend then had enough of their audacity and kicked them out of the house. While doing so, one of the board members shoved some papers into his face and told him, "You need to sign this right now. You've lived here a week already, and these papers had to be signed before moving in." Once they were gone, he took a look at the papers. They were absolutely ridiculous, and gave the HOA rights that were simply unreal. They had, for example, a right to visit your home bi-weekly and check things like that. You don't use the garage for storage, don't have gasoline in containers in your garage. Same goes for propane. You had to mow your lawn every week. Snow had to be shoveled every 2 hours when it snowed, starting at 5 o'clock in the morning. You couldn't park more than 1 car on your grounds, except inside the garage, and a ton of other bullcrap. A few days later, they came back and asked him why he hadn't signed the papers yet. They also wanted to check the garage again. "We need to see if you've made any unauthorized modifications," said the tallest one, trying to peer past my friend into the house. "Not happening," my friend replied. "I'm not joining your club, and you're not coming in." To them, that meant war. Within a week, they had sent him fines north of $1,000, several of which were for denying them access to his home, each worth $250. My friend simply didn't take them seriously and used their stupid letters to help fire his grill. Then came the day where they went extremely too far. He came back, and one of the board members had broken into his garage, stood in it, and was writing things down on his notepad. But that wasn't even the worst part. He had 2 wonderful oak trees in the front of the house. They had been planted by his great-grandparents when they were newlyweds and moved into the house. The HOA was in the process of taking them down. They had called a professional crew for this. One was already so damaged. Basically, all branches were already down. It was just a stump that was left. The other one they had just started with. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" my friend shouted as he ran toward the workers. "Sir, we're just doing our job," one of the crew members said. "Get off my property right now," my friend yelled. He ducking lost it. He told the tree crew to stop right the duck now and explained to them that he was the owner and what they did was highly illegal. They had no idea since the board member claimed these trees were in violation of the rules, since supposedly too many leaves went to the neighbor's garden. My friend had told them that was no legal reason to put them down, but the board member claimed he had given his okay because the trees were in violation of rules of the HOA. He looked it up later. They actually had a bylaw that if a garden produces more than 1 40-liter sack of leaves within 2 weeks, the garden owner needs to take down the offending trees within 2 weeks. "I'll overlook you trespassing," my friend told the tree crew, "if you'll be witnesses in court for me." The crew leader nodded. "We were told this was all authorized. I'm really sorry about your trees." Then he called the cops on the board members for trespassing, breaking and entering. They actually had used a bolt cutter to get into the garage. He had it always closed with a big bike lock after they had tried to get in it twice before. When the police arrived, the HOA president was still there, looking smug. "This is HOA property," the man insisted. "We have every right—" "No, it's my property," my friend interrupted. "Show me where I signed anything giving you authority over my house." The process must have been glorious. Not only did they have to repay him for the lock and the tree, which was worth a crap ton of money, north of $50,000 if I remember right, plus damages for the second tree. He had a professional arborist look after it so all the damage healed properly, which alone cost over $1,000. But these idiots actually thought the trial would have been unfair and tried to fight it, which probably cost them an additional $10,000 to $15,000 in lawyers and court costs. During the trial, the HOA president kept arguing, "We have jurisdiction over all properties in the neighborhood," to which my friend's lawyer responded, "Show me where my client ever agreed to that jurisdiction." All in all, this trial must have cost them over $120,000. Then he went to yet another civil court and sued them for emotional damage. He told them how much these trees meant to him, since his great-grandparents had planted them with seeds from their home country. He really laid it on as thick as he could. Plus, he felt threatened by the HOA and could hardly sleep because he always feared they might try to get into his house. The court actually bought it and gave him $500,000 plus the costs for a state-of-the-art alarm system so he could feel safe again in his own home. "Those trees were my connection to my family history," he told the judge, his voice cracking. "Every time I looked at them, I thought of my grandparents and the stories they told me about sitting under those trees." So put all together, he cost the HOA nearly $750,000. They had to file for bankruptcy and get a person to check the books so my friend would get his money. The best is for last. The mediator found out that these three jerks had been defrauding the HOA for well over 10 years and were giving out as many fines as they possibly could so they could use it to bolster their income. "We found evidence of systematic financial mismanagement," the mediator explained to the homeowners at an emergency meeting. "Funds that should have gone toward community improvements were instead diverted to personal accounts. All three had to sell their houses so they could pay out my friend. Now he is for most people one of the favorite people living there, and he constantly gets invited over for grilling and whatnot. You did what none of us had the courage to do," one neighbor told him at a block party. "Those tyrants have been making our lives miserable for years." You see, most people never wanted the HOA in the first place, but the board members practically forced them to sign the contract, claiming it would not be optional, and if they did not sign before moving in, it would be a $500 fine. Only 6 of the over 50 members actually wanted this HOA, and people think they did get part of the action, as reward for spying on their neighbors to find violations. The next one is an entitled People Story. I moved into my neighborhood about 6 years ago, and it was one of those developments where half the houses were older properties that got grandfathered in when the HOA formed, and the other half were newer constructions built after the association took over. My house was one of the newer ones, but my next-door neighbor was Mrs. Smith, an elderly widow who'd lived on her property since the early days. Her house sat on almost 3 acres of prime land with mature trees, a small pond, and this beautiful garden she'd spent decades cultivating. Mrs. Smith was in her late 70s when I first met her, and she was exactly the kind of neighbor you'd want. She kept to herself mostly, but she'd wave when she saw you and occasionally bring over vegetables from her garden. Her property was immaculate despite her age, and she clearly loved every inch of it. The problem started when our HOA board got a new president. This guy moved in 2 years after me and immediately made it his mission to improve property values and modernize the neighborhood. He lived 3 houses down and had these grand visions of turning our quiet suburban area into some kind of upscale community with amenities and strict aesthetic standards. Mrs. Smith's property became his white whale. Her house was older, painted a cheerful yellow that didn't match the approved HOA color palette, and her gardens were natural and wild rather than the manicured lawns the board preferred. But here's the thing. She was grandfathered in. The HOA had exactly 0 authority over her property because she'd been there first. Her land wasn't even technically part of the HOA jurisdiction. That didn't stop them from trying. It started with friendly visits. The board president and a couple other members would drop by her house, supposedly to chat, but I'd see them gesturing at her property and showing her papers. Mrs. Smith mentioned to me one day that they kept suggesting she might want to sell, that maintaining such a large property must be difficult at her age, that she could move somewhere more convenient. The offers started coming. Low offers. Really low offers. I'm talking maybe 60% of what the property was actually worth. Mrs. Smith showed me one of their written proposals once, and I nearly choked. The board president had framed it as them doing her a favor, helping her liquidate this burdensome asset so she could enjoy her retirement somewhere easier. She told them no repeatedly, but they kept coming back. Then they started getting pushy. They'd show up unannounced, sometimes early in the morning. They'd leave notes on her door. They even started spreading rumors in the neighborhood about how her property was bringing down everyone's home values, which was complete nonsense. That's when they involved me. One evening, the board president showed up at my door with 2 other board members. They wanted to talk about Mrs. Smith's situation. I invited them in, figuring they wanted to ask if I'd check on her or something neighborly like that. Instead, they wanted me to convince her to sell. The board president laid it out. They had plans to purchase her land and develop it into community amenities, a clubhouse, a pool, tennis courts, maybe some additional housing. This would boost all our property values significantly. Mrs. Smith was being unreasonable and stubborn, refusing to accept a fair market offer. As her neighbor, I had influence, and I should use it to help her see reason. I told them I wasn't interested in pressuring my neighbor to sell her home. That's when things got interesting. The board president's friendly demeanor dropped. He informed me that the HOA was pursuing this opportunity for the benefit of all residents and that my refusal to cooperate was noted. Then he added something that would come back to bite him. He said that I needed to stay out of their business with Mrs. Smith, that this was between the board and her, and that any interference on my part would be considered a violation of community cooperation standards. He actually used those words. Stay out of our business. Do not interfere with our legitimate transaction with Mrs. Smith. I asked what exactly constituted interference. He said anything that might discourage her from accepting their offer, any advice I might give her about the property's value, any suggestion that she explore other options. Basically, I was to have no involvement whatsoever in matters concerning her potential sale. I agreed. I said I would stay completely out of their business with Mrs. Smith and would not interfere with any legitimate transactions. They seemed satisfied with that and left. Here's where the malicious compliance started brewing in my mind. Over the next few weeks, I watched the HOA's pressure campaign intensify. They sent her certified letters. They had their lawyer send formal purchase offers. They even tried to get the county involved with bogus complaints about her property maintenance, which went nowhere because her property was in perfect order. Mrs. Smith was miserable. She loved her home and had no intention of leaving, but the constant harassment was wearing her down. She confided in me one afternoon that she was considering accepting their offer just to make it stop, even though the money wouldn't be enough to buy anything comparable elsewhere. That's when I had my idea. I told Mrs. Smith I wanted to make her an offer on her property. A real offer based on actual market value. I'd had my eye on her land since I moved in, not for development, but because it was beautiful and I'd always thought about expanding my own property someday. I proposed something specific. I would pay her fair market value for the property, but she would retain a life estate. She could live there for the rest of her life, exactly as she always had, with no rent, no obligations, nothing changing for her at all. After she passed, the property would be fully mine. She loved the idea. We got everything in writing with a real estate attorney, had the property properly appraised, and I paid her significantly more than the HOA's highest offer. The life estate meant she had complete security and could never be forced out. For me, it meant I was investing in property I'd eventually own while helping someone I genuinely cared about. We closed on the deal within 3 weeks. The HOA found out when the county property records updated. The board president showed up at my door absolutely livid. He was red-faced and practically vibrating with anger. He started yelling about how I'd gone behind their backs, how I'd sabotaged their community development plans, how I'd violated the agreement we'd made. I let him finish his rant, then very calmly reminded him of his exact words. He'd told me to stay out of their business with Mrs. Smith and not to interfere with their legitimate transaction. I had done exactly that. I hadn't interfered with their transaction at all. I hadn't discouraged Mrs. Smith from considering their offers or given her advice about dealing with them. I'd simply made my own, separate, legitimate transaction. He'd been very clear that I should not be involved in their business, so I'd minded my own business instead. His face went from red to purple. He tried to argue that I'd violated the spirit of our agreement, that I'd known what he meant, that this was a betrayal of community trust. I asked him if he was suggesting that his instruction for me to not interfere with legitimate transactions meant I wasn't allowed to make legitimate transactions of my own, because that seemed like an overstep of HOA authority, especially since Mrs. Smith's property wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. He threatened to take legal action. I invited him to do so, noting that everything had been done properly and legally, and that any lawsuit would just cost the HOA money and legal fees with zero chance of success. I also pointed out that if the HOA wanted to argue I'd somehow acted improperly, they'd have to explain why they'd been harassing an elderly woman with lowball offers and pressure tactics for months. The other board members who'd come with him looked uncomfortable. One of them actually apologized and said they just wanted what was best for the community. I told them that Mrs. Smith was part of the community, and what was best for her was being left alone in her home. They left, and over the next few days, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that there was serious division in the HOA. Several residents were actually angry at the board for their handling of the situation, especially once word spread about how aggressively they'd been pursuing Mrs. Smith's property and how little they'd been offering her. The board president tried one last move. He called an emergency HOA meeting and proposed new bylaws that would give the association first right of refusal on any property sales in the neighborhood. The proposal got voted down hard. Turns out a lot of people didn't like the idea of the HOA having that kind of control, especially after seeing how they'd behaved with Mrs. Smith. The board president resigned 2 months later. The new board actually apologized to both Mrs. Smith and me at a community meeting, acknowledging that the previous leadership had overstepped and acted inappropriately. Mrs. Smith is still living happily in her home. Nothing changed for her except she no longer has people harassing her to sell. She still tends her garden, still waves when she sees neighbors, and now she has complete peace of mind knowing she'll never be pressured to leave. As for me, I own some beautiful property that I'll eventually be able to use however I want. I've already decided that when the time comes, I'm keeping every one of those mature trees in that pond. Maybe I'll expand my own house, maybe I'll just maintain it as a nature preserve in Mrs. Smith's memory. Either way, it'll never become an HOA clubhouse. The best part is that I followed their instructions exactly. They told me to stay out of their business and not interfere with their transaction. I did precisely that. I just never agreed not to conduct my own business. They were so focused on bullying an elderly widow into a bad deal that they never considered someone might actually offer her a fair one. That's what happens when you make demands without thinking through all the ways someone might comply with exactly what you asked for. The HOA wanted me to not interfere with legitimate transactions, so I made sure I had a legitimate transaction of my own. They can't complain that I didn't follow their instructions to the letter. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to give them exactly what they ask for. The first one is a petty revenge story. Let me start by saying that I'm not doing drugs, nor have I ever done so. Anyway, this story happened years ago when I was in uni, but it still gives me the chuckles. During university, I had the chance to do a few months at another university. It was far enough away that commuting wasn't an option, so the program put me in touch with a student who were transferring the other way. And we basically agreed to switch living situations. We cleared it with per respective roommates, and everyone was fine with it. When I arrived, I pretty quickly found out I didn't like one of the people living there. Let's go with Karen for her. The feeling was mutual, so I basically kept myself busy since it was only a few months. She was the type who got into everyone's business, especially if they didn't want her to. Now here's a fun fact about me that will be important later. I love licorice. The stronger the better. It's a niche taste. Some years before all this happened, I figured out how to get my fix without eating a ton of candy by buying ammonium chloride powder, also known as salmiak. It's also used to make bread crispy, so you can find it in specialized baking stores and online. It is strong shot, however, and it is mildly acidic. I usually eat what sticks to the tip of my finger. That's the scale to have in mind. Ammonium chloride is a fine, odorless white powder, and I kept my rations in small 10G plastic bags. If you think you have guessed where this is going, you're probably right. I know Karen saw me eat some once in the beginning of my stay because she asked about it and I told her it was candy and she wouldn't like it. Fast forward, there are about 2 weeks left and I come back to the place and notice an ambulance outside. Sure enough, the door to the apartment is open and 2 paramedics are trying to help Karen stop a nosebleed of horrifying proportions. As soon as she saw me, she started screaming that it was my fault. Paramedics asked me if I know anything about what is going on because Karen claimed it came out of the blue. So I asked her specifically if she went into my room, found and took my bag of candy, and then tried to sniff it. She hesitantly admits. "It's not Coke, you idiot, it's salmiak," I tell her, and specify the chemical name for the paramedics. In the end, she had to go to the ER because they weren't sure she hadn't burned a hole in her nasal wall with that stunt. She hadn't, but according to my exchange buddy, she couldn't smell anything for almost 6 months afterwards and still blamed me. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I, 33F, unexpectedly gave birth 2 months earlier than my due date. Thankfully, baby and I are doing great, and we've now made it home. As you can imagine, coming that early meant baby needed a rather long stay in the infant spa, NICU. Now that we're home and I've been able to process everything, I wanted to share a moment of malicious compliance that helped bring some levity to a really scary experience. One of the most important things for a baby, especially preemies, is skin-to-skin time, which is where mothers or fathers will be either topless or open their shirts to cuddle their infant. Baby struggled with jaundice, so our skin-to-skin time was very limited at first because of light therapy. We had been moved to a new location in the NICU, right next to another baby and across from 2 others. A standard of care in the NICU is monitoring the baby's breathing, heart rate, and oxygen levels. These monitors look like an old-school tube TV and are approximately 16 inches by 16 inches, and can display babies in other areas as well if the nurses need. So I'm new to this little care area, and I'm getting ready to set up the hospital-provided screen so I can get my skin-to-skin time, but realize I may end up blocking the monitor for the baby next to me from the nurse. I asked the nurse if she can still see or if my setup was blocking anything for her. Obviously, I don't want to interfere with the care of another patient. She tells me everything was good, so I settle in for some much-needed snuggles. Not even 10 minutes later, I feel someone in my space and look up to see a woman glaring down at me. Once I've made eye contact, Karen starts in on me, while topless and holding baby, so very vulnerable, about how I'm blocking the nurse from caring for her baby. When I try to explain I asked before setting things up, she refuses to listen and continues to lecture and gets more aggressive and angry about how I'm causing her baby not to receive appropriate care and am pushing her out of the care area. After all the emotional stress and frustration of being in the hospital, I finally snapped, looked at the nurse, and told her to take away the screen. The nurse was horrified and started saying, "But your privacy," to which I replied firmly, "It would seem my privacy and modesty don't matter as much as Karen's comfort. Get rid of the screen." This pissed off Karen even more as she realized she'd have to spend the next hour staring at my topless self. She got very annoyed and uncomfortable, especially when the doctors managing rounds and both got flustered and tried to insist I get a new screen. I may have been the AH, but I simply was done and stared right back and said, "According to my neighbor here, my privacy doesn't matter, so we all get to be uncomfortable. When I tell you, if looks could kill, I'd be dead, I'm not joking." The doctors didn't want to deal with it, and the nurses who had to deal with it were laughing quite a bit. They then brought the screen back out and tried to show Karen that they can totally see all her baby's stats on any monitor, so there was no reason for this outburst. I wish I could say this was the last time she freaked out about this, but she pulled this same kind of stunt almost every time I tried to snuggle my baby, until her baby was finally discharged a week later. But seeing the look of shock on her face when I just forced everyone to look at my boobs is probably going to make me giggle every time I think of it. The next one is an entitled parent story. I, 31F, am in shock over the throwdown that I witnessed between my mom, 60s F, and my entitled brother, 26M. Bro has been mooching off of my mom and I, she and I co-own our house, since 2017. He lived rent-free for 4 years. Finally, my mom managed to force him to pay his form of rent by paying some utility bills, a total of about $450 a month, since 2021. He has never paid his bills willingly. Every month he demands to know why he has to pay the amount and demands proof of the cost, as if my mom was trying to swindle him for some reason. And every time he has finally given us the money for the bills, he has told us he was bailing us out, since we must be broke. Why else would we be making him pay for us? Recently, he has been going off about how he can't wait to leave the house and he wants to save his money to move out, but he simply can't with the cost of all these bills weighing him down. My mother told him, since he is so serious about moving out, she will gladly pay for his portion of the bills. She works seasonally. And all he would need to pay was his car insurance. She said she would give him until May 31st to save up as much as he could. He would then need to move out. Since that agreement was made, Entitled Bro has gone on 2 trips out of state. One was a 4-day bachelor party in New Orleans, has gone to poker nights with his friends multiple times, refuses to so much as wash a dish, and leaves a greasy mess wherever he goes in the house. Meanwhile, my mom has worked 6 days a week to make enough money to cover his expenses. And yet, Entitled Bro hasn't thanked her once. Every time she asks him to do the simplest task, he ignores her or claims he forgot, despite how often she reminds him. Today, she finally snapped. His one bill that he's responsible for was due 4 days ago, and he never paid her. She texted him and reminded him verbally many times. She asked via text one last time today, and he finally responded by asking her to give him a receipt so she can prove his insurance costs what she claimed it cost, and he never sent the money. She lost it and said she is sick of catering to him without so much as a thank you. She said she wants peace, and he is no longer worth the trouble she goes through. She said she is removing him from the car insurance tomorrow and that he no longer has until the end of May to move out. He has 3 weeks. That's it. She's threatened to kick him out before and hasn't gone through with it yet, but this time felt different because I have never seen her go nuclear like that before. And Entitled Bro must have felt that same way because he went through the 5 stages of grief about 100 times during that fight. He screamed, cried, accused, name-called, tried to pull me in to defend him, tried to pull in his dad, lives 2 hours away, to defend him, tried to call my mom's sisters to defend him, claimed getting his own insurance was an emotional burden, claimed she needs professional help because she is obviously out of her mind, said that she obviously doesn't care about him, otherwise why would she so cruelly deprive him of such valuable resources? He went on for 3 hours, and she didn't budge. I don't want to get my hopes up that she'll stick to that 3-week deadline, but this is the closest she's come to evicting him. I hope this will scare him into leaving before she has to. Anyway, thank you for watching.